Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jerry's World here in sunny California. I'm in my home office. I'm enjoying a beautiful morning. I'm hoping everybody had a good day, whether it's evening now for you after dinner, you're coming across the pond, or here on the East Coast and having a good afternoon, and of course here having a nice morning here in California. Going to have a pretty good session today. I want to thank you very much for joining me. First of all, I'm Gerald Finken. I'm CEO of RxE2. I'm a pharmacist, but more importantly, a CEO of RxE2. I'm thrilled to be bringing to you the practice of pharmacy and discussing how practice of pharmacy gets involved in clinical research and the difference it's going to make. In a nutshell, the idea is that we're going to have the triad, the pharmacist, the doctor, and the patient, right? The triad, healthcare triad in clinical research, just like it is in the commercial setting. In addition to that, which is really important, RxE2, everyone everywhere, is really bringing clinical research to everyone everywhere. And I think we're all aware how that can occur with the experiences we've had this past year with COVID. Everyone everywhere needs to get vaccinated. And we need to bring a message of clinical research to everyone everywhere. So again, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me. Today, we have a very interesting session. And if you read it, right, the role and impact of CTRP. So I'm going to roll up my sleeves here so we can get into this. CTRP. Oh no, another acronym. Just what we need. But in all seriousness, what I want to point out is by the end of this session, and after I introduce my guest, you're going to know this acronym, and it's going to be an acronym in time in clinical research is going to be just as familiar as CRA, CRO, AI, DCT, DTP. It's going to be that important to what we do. So I have to finish rolling my sleeves. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest, Dr. Kristina Schlecht. Welcome, Tina. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Gerald. Great to be here.
So what does CTRP mean, Tina? What does that stand for?
Clinical Trials Research Pharmacist.
Excellent. Got that, everybody? Clinical Trials Research Pharmacist. Now, I'm doing this because I have a 2-year-old granddaughter, and we do this a lot. And so everybody learns, like, CTRP. So memorize that as we move forward, as I get into out of my grandpa mode now into my pharmacist mode. So Tina, again, thanks for joining me. You're a pharmacist, are you not?
I am.
Yeah. So before we go anywhere else, why don't we talk a little bit about you and give the audience a little bit of background of your experiences and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. I have had the tremendous, been very fortunate throughout my career in that I've been able to build programs and work with tremendous individuals in a variety of practice settings. But really, for me, it always comes down to independent community pharmacy as well as clinical research. And it goes all the way back to school. Of course, I'm a graduate of North Dakota State. And North Dakota has a very unique pharmacy law within the state in that 51% of the pharmacy needs to be owned by the pharmacist. There are some companies that are grandfathered in, but it's the only state in the union that requires pharmacist ownership of a pharmacy. And so with that, by the time I graduated, there was only one Walgreens in the state, and it didn't have a pharmacy within it. And later on, some CVSs were grandfathered in through some acquisitions. But beyond that, it was all independent community pharmacy, and that's what I grew up with, so to speak. So I have a real heart for that and understanding what the community pharmacy brings to local communities. From there, I went on to do a residency within the North Dakota Institute of Pharmaceutical Care. They're learning about the start of what we called pharmaceutical care back in the day, but bringing patient services into the pharmacy, things that were an extension of dispensing medications. And I think it was during the end of my residency where, Gerald, you and I met at a conference. And you had started CSM at that time, Clinical Supplies Management. We got to talking and you told me about this really amazing idea that you had for bringing the practice of pharmacy into clinical research. And you and I got talking about the practice of counseling patients enrolled in clinical studies. And you told me that this wasn't being done at the time, and I was amazed that it wasn't, because counseling is so integral on the commercial side to the practice of pharmacy. And I think we both walked away from that conversation really engaged and wanted to look at what further collaboration could look like. And you were so kind to offer me a position at CSM. And what would become the function of CTRP, we didn't have any work for it at that time. So I came on as business development, and we sold the first pilot. And then I was able to move into the position that I really wanted, which was into clinical trials research pharmacist. And from there, we spent the next handful of years really building out the service, understanding what goes into it and what the impact of it could be. So those were some very, very good years at CSM, learning about how to integrate CTRP into clinical trials.
But then we parted ways, did we not?
We did.
Yes.
My husband and I had an opportunity to move overseas. I call it a life opportunity. So it was a big decision, but we made that decision to move overseas. So I left CSM and we spent a couple of years abroad. And when I came back, we moved to the DC area. And I was looking for the right fit of a position, and there was an opportunity at the National Community Pharmacists Association, so a trade association representing independent pharmacies, back again to the roots of independent community pharmacy. And there I had a great opportunity to learn about the business aspects of independent pharmacy and make some great connections. Following that, Gerald, you and I had the opportunity to work together again with CTRP at Centerpoint Clinical Services. And then I spent a little bit of time in drug safety, clinical safety. And then here at RxE2, when you launched this company, it's just been a tremendous opportunity to really bring together the aspects of community pharmacy as a business and clinical research. So it's been a long time in coming, but it's really been just a great background to where we are today.
Yeah, it has been a long time, Jim, that we've known each other and worked together. And both of us, I think the fire inside us about this concept has never burned out. You know, it's been kindling there for a long time. And I personally think this is why, again, I'm having you on this session to present, because I think it's extremely important with where we are in clinical research today, of the role that can be played. And we'll get into the details of some of that. I want to really share with everybody. Again, where we were, 15, 20 years ago when we first started doing some of that counseling services. You know, I think at the time it wasn't ready for it. Just like it wasn't ready for my own demand concept. And now it's an industry standard that I think the same thing's going to happen here. But it's not necessarily when I think about it, like as we're learning, and with all the pharmacists we're dealing now, with all those community pharmacists and stuff, we're learning quite a bit too. And it really is going to be where you and the community pharmacist takes this, not so much about the things that, where the ideas I had, that's a big picture, but the implementation making happen is where this is going to go. And that's what I'd like to get into a little bit. Before we dive into this a little bit further and ask a couple more questions for you, Tina, I want to remind everybody that in this video session, you can all have a chat ability there. And so you can type in your message and let me know whether I should be quiet or not, and let Tina speak, or ask questions is the most important thing. And I'll try to take it sometimes on the fly, but at the very least, if there's questions, I'll look at the end of the session to ensure that we're addressing your questions as we move through this discussion today about CTRP. So please use that. As I've said before in some of my webinars, this is like decentralized clinical trials. We're doing telehealth right now. You have pharmacists on the line. You can act like you're the patient, and you're going to ask us questions. And if you have difficulty doing that, just imagine you're a patient on the clinical trial, and we're expecting you to do chats with us and video conference with us. So don't be afraid. There are no questions that are silly. Even like, what does CTRP stand for again? And we'll gladly go over that. So with that out of the way, team, there's just one more thing I'd like to ask before we get into the CTRP specifically. Why did you become a pharmacist?
Great question. There's a number of healthcare practitioners in my family, so physicians and whatnot. And like most kids, you look at being a doctor and whatnot. And I had a chance to visit with a few doctors, and it didn't really seem like a great fit to me. Nursing wasn't of interest, but somebody, a friend of the family, recommended pharmacy, and I really hadn't thought about that whatsoever. And so I went to my local hospital pharmacy and started volunteering to see what it was all about. And I really enjoyed being in healthcare, the aspects that are of helping people, but not necessarily as hands-on that I was looking for.
Excuse me. No, I don't have COVID. Sorry. Sorry, Tim.
That's all right. Yeah, and from there, it just one thing after another, everything that I learned about pharmacy, I just loved what I was learning, and the opportunity to help educate patients, to help people, and to advocate for better health all spoke to things that I wanted to do.
That's it's almost every time I talk to a pharmacist, there's always a passion and drive about being in the healthcare profession. Just as I know all healthcare professionals, most healthcare professionals that I meet with, there's that key thing that happened. Just like I see the leaders of the advocacy groups, there's something that switched on that just is so compelling. You mentioned hospital pharmacy, you mentioned community pharmacy, and we're going to talk about CTRP. For the audience and for those attending today, would you just talk a little about, you and I know about the practice of pharmacy, but people see practice of pharmacy, but there are different sections. Like you said, you were the NCPA, right? NACP, National Association of Community Pharmacists. Could you just talk a little bit about the different aspects of pharmacy that are out there?
Sure, absolutely. And this is somewhat interesting as well, and interesting of how I got into clinical research, because as I mentioned, I volunteered at the hospital pharmacy. So there's the big buckets of pharmacy that people are most familiar with are hospital pharmacy and retail pharmacy. And so I volunteered at the local pharmacy. At that time, it was in the basement. They never saw a patient. I wasn't really, I knew I wanted to do pharmacy, but I didn't want to do that kind of pharmacy. I wanted to see patients. Things have changed since then, fortunately. And then in the retail setting, there's independent community pharmacy, which operates as its own independent business. And then there's chain pharmacy that operates obviously as a chain with a number of pharmacies at different locations. And there were certainly aspects about the community pharmacy that I really enjoyed, the patient education, the engagement. But again, at that time, there were a fair number of issues with insurance and the types of things that got in the way of good patient care at the time. And so when I found clinical research, and particularly at CSM, I was very intrigued, because that is not an area that a lot of people think of pharmacists participating. But life science, pharmaceutical industry, there are pharmacists that are involved in bench science, in administering of the medications, of development, all the way along, just not in the numbers that we're used to seeing. Pharmacists also practice in government agencies, and there's a number of different places for pharmacists to practice.
Thanks. I like to think about it. When I talk to people, when you say, what do you do, you're a pharmacist, they think about what I do with this, right? Mm-hmm. Count out the pills and put them in a bottle, and very rarely do they really think about this aspect. And as we move into when like at RxE2, we talk about the community pharmacists, we're talking about like the independent community pharmacists. And some of it is like culture and business structure. When I think about like chain stores, and I know there's been some bad press recently about the overworked conditions in the chains, and it's in all healthcare, especially with COVID. And I want to say, that's still the practice of pharmacy. They're still dispensing, they're still making sure patients get the right medication at the right time. The 5 hours or 6 hours or 10 hours, depending on how many hours you want to include. Really, but it's like I want to say there's a root or an underlying similarity. That it's understanding we're the medication experts, and we have knowledge about that to share with patients. And so in every practice, and more so now with hospitals, especially non-hospitals where, the pharmacy's coming out from the basement, realizing the real impact of pharmacy is in communication.
Absolutely.
So I'm sorry, Tina, yes?
Oh, I was just going to say, there's been so much work that's been done to including pharmacists as an integral part of the entire healthcare team. That's come a long ways in the last number of years, which is great to see, because that's certainly where it belongs.
Actually, can we go back to your days at the NECP, right?
NCPA?
NCPA, sorry, National Community Pharmacy Association.
Another
right?
acronym.
Another acronym. No. What were some of your initiatives there, actually? Because that's focused on the community pharmacy. Because I know, like, the American ASC, another acronym for the hospitals. There's a chain pharmacy associations. And so for the community pharmacists, what were some of the initiatives that you were driving there?
Sure, absolutely. So with the National Community Pharmacists Association, there was a strong push within the association just for government advocacy, making sure that pharmacists, and particularly independents, were recognized when new regulations were enacted and things that would affect the business of doing pharmacy, if you will. The items that I worked on particularly was long-term care. We had started a long-term care division at that time, and also just some pharmacy, I think we called it pharmacy affairs. Adherence was one of my particular areas that we concentrated on, because we knew that adherence leads to all good things for all patients. If patients are adherent to their medication, they're taking it correctly, they're taking the doses as they should, and they're getting refills as they should and as the prescriber intended. And that's very good for patients. It's very good for pharmacies. So we were working to help pharmacies put together adherence programs for their pharmacies and for their businesses.
Excellent. Let's then move into the CTRP, Clinical Trials Research Pharmacist. You were there on the ground floor and really created this model. Do you want to just walk through some of that about, some of the lessons learned or hurdles, or, just the concept itself and how it was implemented? And again, and specifically focus on the CTRP aspect.
Mm-hmm. Sure, absolutely. I might frame it up a little bit differently, in starting with how CTRP, the practice what we consider as the practice would be a little bit different from what you'd see in a retail or hospital setting, in that it's focused on clinical research. And with that, we spend a lot of extra time in training, because the pharmacists need to understand the global regulations as it pertains to clinical research, the ICH, FDA guidelines, the SOPs, internal SOPs, company protocols, et cetera. So we spend a lot of time on training. And then I would say the execution of the work in clinical research is different than what you'd see in many hospital or retail settings, in that the documentation is extensive, and then the way that we do things can be quite intentional. And an example of that is how we approach counseling. And our counseling was done in a very intentional way, so we could elicit information from the patients to understand what they knew about how to take the medication, and understand how they understood that they were going to use it at home. And that way we were able to understand what they were doing, so that we could then advise and answer questions if they were doing things that wasn't exactly as intended or as instructed.
Along those lines, I mean, that's an interesting, as you said that, this idea of like open-ended questions, versus like I think about like Dale Carnegie's sales technique. It's like getting them saying yes, and in this case, you don't want to be saying yes or no, right? Mm-hmm. You just want information.
Yep.
And actually, so in obtaining that, I mean, then talk about, if you wouldn't mind, the impact of that, or how do you, right? So now you're a pharmacist counseling patients in a clinical trial, versus the site, right, is supposed to be counseling patients in a clinical trial. What's the difference?
Sure, absolutely.
And why?
Sure, absolutely. And this is why I found it interesting when you first told me that pharmacists weren't really engaging with patients in clinical trials in this same manner, because sometimes you think what's happening in the commercial side is happening everywhere, and in this case it wasn't. So what typically happens in a clinical trial is that the patient will sign an informed consent that outlines what they will participate in, what they understand they'll be doing in the study. They visit with the investigator about what they need to be doing. They'll visit with the coordinator about how to take the medication, and then they'll go home and they may have some follow-up from the site, et cetera. But that's the extent of their medication education. With CTRP, we added in a patient interaction, phone call, telemedicine, as you like. We add in a patient visit, specifically with the pharmacist, the medication expert, to go over the medication use itself. So that would be how to take it, how to store it, what to do if you're traveling, et cetera, what to do if you miss a dose and whatnot. And it really focuses on the medication. And one of the things that we found is that some of these patients are our most educated patients, if you will. Again, they've signed the informed consent. They've spoken with the investigator, the nurse, and they get home and they still don't know exactly what they're going to do, or they had questions that they didn't know to ask when they were at the site, and they get home and they're left with wondering what to do next. And so our timely calls were able to let the patients tell us what they understood, and then we could affirm that, which provides them great confidence, or we could redirect if they needed additional information as to how they were going to take it correctly.
So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, and as I think about that, first of all, how did the sites react to that?
Sure. Most of the sites were very supportive, happy to have a pharmacist on the team and involved. There were some investigators that had questions about if a patient did this or reported that, but we always report back to the site. The site's always given a detailed report about what was discussed, and if there's any urgent issues, those get immediate contact back to the site and the sponsor as appropriate. And so we allayed those fears, and we found during the study that we'd have sites that would call us and actually ask us to call their patients if their patients were having trouble with a device so that we could help, because we got so adept at doing so. And also in our follow-up surveys with the sites, the majority of coordinators were very happy to have a pharmacist on the team.
So you're, just like in the hospital settings, you're considered part of the team for each of the sites.
Mm-hmm.
And who did you have at the sites? Who was your primary contact?
The coordinators.
Yeah, that's it assumes as much. Did you have any interactions with the PI?
Yes. Yep. Definitely some, but primarily the study coordinators.
And just to take it further, if I could, but you talked to a lot of patients during this time. Mm-hmm. Do you have some nuggets or things like, do you mind sharing? Like, were there memorable conversations or?
Mm-hmm. Sure, absolutely. I think the thing as a whole, what's most memorable is when we looked at our stats, we helped 92% of our patients with a question or an issue. 92% is huge. And we go back to the conversation we had earlier about wanting to help people, and helping 92% of our patients is helping people with their participation in the study and helping those studies succeed, quite frankly. All of the
because I have a pet peeve about percentages, because they're a unitless number. You can make 100% of nothing is still nothing. But on 92%, they had questions. It's like, did you help them open their mail that day? Did you tell them what channel to go to the weather? I mean, is that helping a patient? What do you mean by, so 92 people, 92 patients out of 100, you help them with what? I mean, sure. What can you, sorry for me, because.
Yes, well, let me throw some real numbers at you then.
Okay.
For the data set that I'm speaking about, we spoke with 4,600 patients. We made over 30,000 patient contacts. And of those, 92% we helped with various issues. To get into more detail of that 92%, 31% were related to concomitant medications. Either patients were taking something when they started the study that was prohibited by the inclusion-exclusion criteria, or perhaps there was a change in their concomitant medication that they hadn't told the site about just yet. They started something new or stopped something that they needed to check in with the site with about prior. So 31% related to con meds. 36% were related to taking the study medication. What time of day were they taking it? How are they taking it in relation to meals, etc. 37% was related to not taking the wrong dose, if you will. 37% taking the wrong dose.
This is on top of everything that the site has done.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is in addition to the
after they get home. Mm-hmm.
And is this all like, and because you're making many calls, so is this over the life of the patient, the life of the study? These numbers?
Correct. Yeah.
So did you find like some of these were they front loaded? You know, compliance, was that an issue in the beginning and not in the middle, maybe in the end? I mean, because say you had 4 phone calls with a patient, or well, actually, how many phone calls would you have with a patient?
Sure. It very much depended on the study, how long the patient was enrolled, the purpose of our calls, et cetera. We always start out wanting to do a call within the first 1 or 2 days of the patient's enrollment, because that time is critical, and that's the time when we found when we had most of our interventions, because it's brand new. So patients are getting home, they're realizing they didn't quite understand the instructions, or they had questions, et cetera. And then from there, it really, we'd call generally a week later, do a check-in, and then from there on, it depended on the length of the study and what we were looking at for retention within the study. But once you set a patient up well at the beginning with instructions and information that they can understand starting out, then they proceed to be compliant through the remainder of the study.
Did the type of conversations or findings change through the study? Like from the first calls to second to thirds? I mean, did patients transition in their interests or what the conversations were?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep, they would tend to. There were things that typically the first few calls mostly had to do with how they were taking the medication and following the instructions that they needed to use it. Later calls had to do with more of I would call it lifestyle questions, things that they ran out of ancillary supplies, or they were going to take a trip and they needed to know what to do as far as the study medication and how they were going to travel with it. Missed doses happened later on in the study. Those types of things. We certainly saw some trending in that area, but once you set them up correctly with good education to start, you have some very compliant patients going forward.
I just had 3 questions and they all just went out the door. As I came to the next thing, I was just thinking like, and was it successful?
It was very successful.
And how do you measure success in that?
92% of patients had an intervention.
Yeah. I'm talking about strategically. You know, what was the outcomes of the trials?
They were very good. One of the things that we measured was patient retention. And the studies that we worked on had improved patient retention, meaning that they could close enrollment sooner than anticipated. Yeah. Fortunately, also the studies that we worked on, a majority of them were approved. They were drugs that were approved by the FDA and are now in commercial use.
Excellent. If I could, without, I remember one of the questions I wanted to ask because I get, you gave numbers and concepts of what you did without, I don't think it'd be a privacy violation. Is there any like memorable specific stories?
Sure.
Like to this day, it's like, oh, I remember. I mean, I have some personal stories in my career, and I don't want to get into it because they always make me cry because it's like these patient advocates, have these life stories they tell you, and they're just, the human side of it is just heart-wrenching, but yet they're so optimistic, and it's just about things. And so anyhow, did you have any of those moving or memorable people interactions?
Absolutely. The first one I'm going to tell you is not a person specific, but I think it's a very important demonstration of how sponsors and everyone, that we try to do our very best in planning and execution of the programs that we are executing. And one of the first studies we worked on, it was intended to be a large program for this particular sponsor. It was the first of many in a series of trials they were planning. And as we got started, we looked at the instructions for use. And from North Dakota, but a city girl, such as it is in North Dakota, and the instructions for use were to take at breakfast and to take at dinner. And my background is dinner is an evening meal in the 5 p.m., 6 p.m. range. But I knew that my friends on the farm, dinner was at noon, lunchtime. So when we started counseling, we were asking patients, tell me what time of day you're taking the medication. And sure enough, some patients were taking it at breakfast like they were told. And then in some regions of the country, patients were taking it at noon, and others, they were taking it 5 p.m., 6 p.m., whatnot. That is huge when it comes to the execution of your trial. Could you imagine the results if half the patients, not quite half, were taking it at noon versus 5 p.m.? So we identified that very early on, and the sponsor retrained, it relabeled everything, retrained the sites. For probably half that study, we were still finding patients that were thinking that they needed to take that medication at noon. So the impact there was immediate and significant.
I remember how embarrassed I was, like learning dinner was at 6 p.m. I grew up on a farm in New Jersey, in Northeast Pennsylvania. And it's like, I remember the embarrassment of like, what's dinner? Like, wait a minute,
Right.
Yeah.
And it was something that just didn't cross the minds. So that was a huge find by CTRP. Another one, getting more personal. I remember there was a study we were working on, and the patients needed to administer self-injections at home. And I think I'm thinking it was a weekend day, and I was on the phone with a patient who was doing their first injection at home. And he told me that he was a race car driver. He races cars for a living. And he was absolutely petrified about injecting using this very small needle, 31 gauge, to do his self-injection at home. And we talked about it, and we talked through it, and lo and behold, he ended up doing it while I was on the phone with him, and he was so proud of himself, and well, he should be. But from then on, he did a great job. But it was just one of those times of being there for a patient when they needed a little extra help and holding hands.
Excellent. I got a great question that's something related to that I was going to ask, and a participant asked, what have been surprising hurdles you've encountered establishing CTRP services? And what I really like the examples of that is like legal limitations, sponsors, site buy-in, patient acceptance. Great question, by the way.
Oh, sure, absolutely. The hurdles always come, I think, in just it's new, it's different. I think sometimes companies don't want to be the first to use a new service like this, and then market acceptance is a challenge. We know the impact that we have, how helpful it is for sponsors, but sometimes it can be seen as an additional service. Whereas the sites and the coordinators are a part of their responsibility is certainly medication counseling. But this service adds to support them in what they're doing. Haven't run into too many issues as far as legal acceptance. Patients are always very welcoming. They're used to visiting with pharmacists on the commercial side, so they're very happy to engage with a pharmacist. And again, a majority of the sites are always happy to have us involved as well as part of the integrated healthcare team.
How did you handle the regulatory aspects? I mean, were there any regulatory issues that you had to address?
It's more so just answering questions. Are we on the 1572? Because we're doing direct patient contact, we should be listed in the protocol. things like that. But they're just questions that we need to answer. And
how were they? Do you remember how they were answered for the protocols and projects that you're on? I mean, how are they answered? What would you tell somebody? This is how. What would you recommend to somebody if they're going to bring on CTRP?
Sure, absolutely. We definitely want to be included in the protocol because, again, direct patient contact. We'll have a set schedule of when we would make contact with patients so that everybody's aware of that. Need to go through training with the site so they're aware of us and that they know that our reports will be incoming and that we'll have direct contact with their patients and how they'll receive information about that. And then from there, it's pretty straightforward, just making sure that everybody is aware of what the additional steps are in making sure if there's any questions that come up or urgent issues from a patient perspective, how to keep the sponsor and investigator aware.
I want to tag along that question to something that comes up all the time. And I was attending a webinar and there's some publications on it recently that I've read that talks about trust. And they talk about what are the limitations around. I'm talking decentralized clinical trials. And when I think about people coming into my home, I think about even traditional going to a clinical site, getting a robocall, or a text message, that's all from people I don't know, out of my world. One of the things we've always talked about is the pharmacist-patient trust. Now, in the community setting, I get it. There's, the patient and the pharmacist. I mean, I've worked in community. I know how that is. Absolutely there. So, how did you address that trust? And the two things are trust and engagement. How did you address the trust and engagement with patients?
Sure, absolutely. Part of it is making patients aware. So it was included in the informed consent that they would be visiting with a pharmacist. At that time, when we were a little more paper-based, we had a handout that the patients would receive with the pharmacist's picture on it and a little introductory paragraph that we'd be contacting them about the study medication, et cetera. And then when we made contact, we tried our best to ensure that the same pharmacist would reach out to the same patient each time so that they could develop that trust and rapport that we like to find in healthcare. And those steps served us very well.
So the same pharmacist would stay with the patient?
Correct.
Got it. Okay. And were the conversations along those lines, like, did you find, establishing that trust was, did you have to earn it? I mean, like, how hard was it to earn the patient's trust?
Sure. Everyone is different. And I would say a majority of patients, again, were very welcoming of our calls. They answered our questions. Again, we're working to elicit information from them so that they're telling us what they know and what they understand, and we're answering their questions in a timely manner, being available after hours and on weekends if they have trouble is very helpful. In healthcare, many patients who don't actively work in healthcare or don't have a healthcare background, healthcare is a mystery, and they really want somebody to help them understand it. Help them understand how to use a medication, help them understand their disease state, et cetera. And they don't always have the questions to ask to get the information that they really need or want. So it's up to us to help provide education as we're engaging with patients along the way. And certainly there were a few patients that I would say tolerated our calls, would answer our questions, and then we're done. And that's just fine. Not everybody engages with people differently. But on the whole, the patients were very engaging with us.
And I think about it, it became very experienced at it in the community pharmacy. When to be quiet, when to ask questions, when to listen, when to talk. A lot of experience there. Please, everybody, we're going to start wrapping this up. I have a couple more questions. But please, if you have questions, please send it to the chat. It'd be very helpful just to making sure that your questions are being answered. So if I can come back to the role of the CTRP, and one of the things that comes up again, I just read something about the placebo effect, and I have my own opinions about placebo effect and this term biased, right? Was that at all a concern? You know, of course, no, you were talking to all patients.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, let's just talk about that bias. Like, so you're having this conversation, right? What would you, and I'm just to leave it out there. So what do you think about bias in what CTRP did?
Sure. I would say the topic of bias is certainly long and deep, and probably more extensive than we have time to get into here today. But a couple of things that we do with CTRP is, number one, all the patients should receive the same type of service, if you will, the same type of call or the same type of interaction with the pharmacist. So to make sure that patients are receiving the same steps within the clinical trial.
Of course.
Also working with a team to develop our questions, our engagement with the patients, to ask open-ended questions and elicit response from the patients that is not pre-biasing them, or we're not asking questions in a certain way that they would answer in a certain way, being very cautious of that. And then also it depends on the type of therapeutic area as well that we think more about bias in certain situations.
So I can't help it, but I think about surveys, and I've seen some surveys recently, and all you think about the questionnaire is open-ended. I'm thinking, so typically what clinical research does is they say, will DCT be successful? Or what is your impact on DCTs? And it's going to impact this, it's A, B, C, and D, and they give you 5 answers. And I'm looking at those, it's none of those. But I'm supposed to select one, right? And so I'm being biased against it, I think. So what you're saying is that your question would be like a blank A, a blank B, a blank C, and let the patient fill it in? And I laugh because it's like the term bias, we could go into a lot of discussions about that even just, and of course we talk about bias and algorithms and stuff too. And again, we'll switch subject now from bias, because we could go down that rabbit hole pretty quickly. And I'd love to have a discussion like that. Just quickly, I want to talk about decentralized clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And we know telemedicine, right? Everybody, that became the big issue, telemedicine. And of course, we understand state regulations. Really put it like, wait a minute, you can't be a doctor in California talking to a patient in Pennsylvania, right? So let's talk about the practice of pharmacy and telepharmacy under the telehealth, telemedicine. Mm-hmm. So what do you like talk about? How do you do that?
Excuse me for a second. Right. So state regulations always have an impact on how we perform CTRP, because we certainly need to be mindful of what state regulations are, as well as federal regulations, making sure our pharmacists are licensed appropriately and trained, et cetera. So that's part of it. And then from there, the mechanism, whether it be a phone call, a telehealth visit, a video, et cetera, making sure that the communications are secure in and of themselves, and that the patient can participate in the option that they're given. Beyond that, it's pretty straightforward. In North Dakota, they've been doing telepharmacy for, I think, is it 1 or 2 decades now? So they're very, very deep in that particular topic. For some patients, it's very helpful to have a televisit. And other patients, if they don't have access to broadband, they might be challenged by that particular option.
So moving further, where I really want to go is at DCTs. How do you see the CTRP fitting into decentralized clinical trials?
Very well, the same as we would a standard clinical trial. And then if not, and with the impact being the same, if not slightly more, because while particularly now in these COVID times, we've all become a little bit more tech savvy, and the functionality of video conferencing and whatnot is certainly improved, but not all patients have that same ability. So there's still a need for possibly one-on-one assistance. There's still a need to address patient questions and concerns and any type of issues they might have in using that technology.
Got it. So I don't see any more questions at this point. And I want to say thank you. But before we go there, any last piece of information you want to share with us? Or, I've asked you a bunch of questions. Is there anything that you were hoping we were going to talk about that we didn't talk about that you'd like to share with everybody? Or
Sure.
you can talk about your daughter,
No, I think this has been just a great conversation today. I always love talking about CTRP, as you know. I think, though, the one remaining thought I have is the idea that pharmacists, services, patient care services, adherence, it has taken a long time for the impact and the pharmacist's ability to be recognized in the commercial setting. But that's changing. That's coming to light more so, and we're seeing results that pharmacists have tremendous impact with their patients on these topics. And I think as we look at clinical research, we still have some significant numbers in clinical research as it pertains to adherence, around 40%, retention. Sometimes we can have up to 30% dropout in a study. And those are significant issues that the industry, the life science industry, faces, that pharmacists are part of the answer. All the reasons that we talked about today.
So actually fitting in, right? What's your title?
Chief Pharmacy Officer.
Do you know any other chief pharmacy officers?
Typically, it is a title that pertains to large health systems and managed care organizations where they're taking a number of pharmacies and trying to align the companies or the overarching companies' goals with the individual pharmacy goals to make sure that they have good outcomes as it pertains to clinical, financial outcomes, et cetera. So that's where that title typically comes from. I do know a few. Here in clinical research, we haven't seen this title be used to a great extent. And I think for RxE2, it really calls out the company's commitment to pharmacy as part of the company as a whole, to have a seat at the table, to talk about alignment of the company's strategic initiatives, setting goals, addressing system-wide issues. It's very important to be able to have a voice at the table.
I just will finish up by giving a shout out to all the frontline people, healthcare providers in every aspect, who were immediately out there servicing all the people with COVID, which included pharmacists. And now I want to give a shout out to pharmacists for actually leading the vaccination charge. And I'm very proud to say, when I take a look at those states that are leading in the percentage of, that for 100,000 inoculations, are those states where community pharmacists are leading the charge, like West Virginia, North Dakota, I think South Dakota's up there, Montana. So those states where community pharmacists are actively involved. But of course, even with the CVSs, et cetera, it's just great that the practice pharmacy is leading the immunization process. So shout out to all pharmacists for assisting in this, being on the front line. Makes me very proud to be a healthcare professional. So with that said, Tina, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. As always, it's a pleasure speaking with you. To the audience, I want to say thank you very much for being in attendance. Reach out to me through RxE2, reach out to me at Finken, Gerald Finken, and through LinkedIn. I get all those messages forward through. If you have questions or want to connect, please do so. I want to point out to everybody that I'm excited about our next live session. This will be our 5th live session. It'll be on April 20th. Let me make sure I got that right. April 20th at 1 p.m., same time. So same bat channel, same bat time. That just shows my age, if anybody else remembers that. But I'm really excited because I'm going to have the executive director of DIME Association, a nonprofit organization, digital medicine. And I'm excited about that, digital medicine. And when you really think about that, right, we know what medicine is, digital medicine. Anyhow, you're going to find all about that, what that means at our next session when I have Jennifer Goldsack as the executive director of DIME joining us for the next live session. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, everybody. And Tina, again, thank you. And have a great rest of the afternoon, evening, or morning. Right? Take care, everybody. Right? Bye-bye.
Thank you.